Hello, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm a researcher here at the Charter Cities Institute. This is the second Q&A we've done with researchers who were set to present their work at our Charter Cities conference in Johannesburg back in March. As previously mentioned, the conference unfortunately had to be canceled due to the recent travel restrictions, but we've now decided to do these presentations remote with the help of Zoom. So with that, today I'm joined by Nicholas Lipolis, which, as I've already told him, is the best name ever conceived. Nicholas is a PhD candidate in political science at Oxford University and a researcher at Oxford Center for the Study of African Economies. Nicholas's doctoral research looks at the politics of industrial policy with a focus on Ethiopia and Angola. So hello, Nicholas. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Curtis. It's a pleasure. Thanks for hosting me.
Great. So the agenda for today, Nicholas has a 15-minute-ish slide deck that he's going to go through that presents the main takeaways from a paper he wrote with several co-authors called Can Africa Learn from the Chinese Urbanization Story? So I'll let him start to get that presentation ready to go. And then after the slides, we'll have a brief Q&A between me and him, me asking Nicholas some questions, and we'll end by letting folks know where they can go if they'd like to learn more or have further questions about the research. So you can tee that presentation up, Nick. Maybe before he gets started, Nicholas, perhaps it'd be good for you to give everybody a brief background on what the Center for the Study of African Economies does, what IGC does, the International Growth Center, and how your research fits into that work as well.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you can see the title slide. So this project is a collaboration between CSAE, the IGC Cities That Work program, and the Center for International Knowledge and Development. That's a think tank in China, looking at how China's development experience, what does it mean for us. So this collaboration is between three institutions engaged in research and policy. So I'll introduce a bit the work of CSAE, which is the aim of CSAE is to provide rigorous research on economic development in Africa. It has over 30 years of history doing that. And it also has a lot of policy engagement. So we're a research institution based at the University of Oxford, englobing different departments, the Blavatsky School of Government, the International Development Department, and the Economics Department. And so that's a function of CSAE. The International Growth Center is a research institute that focuses on demand-led, policy-relevant research. And it's housed at the London School of Economics and the University of Oxford. Within the International Growth Center, there's a program called Cities That Work, which is focused on policy-focused synthesis of research on urban policy and establishing networks with people engaged in urban policy across Africa. And so the collaboration between these different research institutions is underpinning this project. There's the aim of this project on urbanization. Sorry, let me just introduce the people involved. So Stefan Durkin and I are at CSAE, and Astrid Haas and Sebastian Kritikos, they are Cities That Work, IGC. And we came together for this project, which aims to compare the urbanization experiences of China and Africa. So the aim of this project is to study the drivers of urbanization in China and see, what do they mean for studying contemporary urbanization in Africa. So the idea is to look at the factors that have driven the way China has urbanized, how these factors have played out in the African context, respecting all contextual differences, observing if there's any policy implications that can be glimpsed from this contrast. But then from this, going through this process, we can also study what is generalizable and what is not generalizable from China's development experience. And so, with all that went right and all its pitfalls of the Chinese urbanization experience, and we believe that this contrast can be very illuminating, both for China and for Africa. And so, without further ado, let me explain a little bit. This presentation is based on the background paper that we wrote for the project. And so we're looking at a general picture. So in the first part of the presentation, I'll illustrate some of the factors that we have looked at in the background paper. And then I'll focus on one of the case studies that constitute the second phase of the project.
Great.
So the underlying premise for this project is that Africa is urbanizing very fast. As we can see in the slide, the projections are for rapid urban growth, reaching up to 2.5 billion people by 2050, up from slightly above 1 billion at the moment. So that's a lot of people entering Africa's urban areas, and that's a massive policy challenge that people across the world are dealing with at the moment. Of course, the same challenge was faced by China not so long ago. China was an overwhelmingly rural country up to the eve of reforms in the early 80s, late 70s. But it successfully managed to accommodate 300 million new rural migrants in its urban areas in the space of 3 decades. Of course, this wasn't without problems, without flaws in the urbanization model, but still, the fact that they were managed to incorporate so many people in such a short space of time is a remarkable achievement. And the premise of the project is to understand, what lessons can be learned from it. Unfortunately, African urbanization has not proceeded as well as that of China. And in this chart, we can see one of the main differences in the two processes. While China, like other Asian countries, urbanization has moved in tandem with rising incomes, the relationship has not been as strong in African countries, as you can see from the chart here. In some cases, some countries have urbanized while actually growing poorer. This is mostly driven by conflict, but nonetheless, even in the other countries, we can see that the relationship is not so strong. And that has generated problems for the African countries. Why has that been the case? We can see that in the Chinese urbanization experiences, the early stages of urbanization were largely driven by rural reforms in rural areas, the famous township and village enterprises, which led to rising agricultural productivity, as we can see in the chart on the right, which shows the ratio of urban to rural income. And that was constituted the push of the Chinese urbanization. Meanwhile, the pull of the Chinese urbanization experience was the massive urbanization that occurred in its urban areas, not only in urban areas, but predominantly in urban areas. We can see in these charts that if you look on the right, for example, the share of industry of the secondary sector, which is essentially manufacturing, but also construction, in China was very high. And that the employment share, if you look on the left, we can see that the employment share rose over time. So there was an urbanization underpinned by rising agricultural productivity, constituting the pull, and the growth of the manufacturing sector, constituting the push, and the growth of the manufacturing sector constituting the pull. And as is well known from the economic development literature, the manufacturing sector comes with a series of advantages, such as being labor intense and having scope for further productivity gains. In Africa, things have been somewhat different. We can see that there wasn't the same rise in agricultural productivity. Okay, fair enough, this is a cross-regional comparison, but we can see that Africa fell far behind East Asia, China and other East Asian countries in terms of agricultural productivity. And industrialization has not been there. We can see if these figures are to be believed, despite all the problems that they usually are with data in Africa, but they do indicate deindustrialization. At least there hasn't been a rise in the importance of the manufacturing sector in Africa. And that has important consequences for the shape of its urbanization, because the migrants flowing into urban areas in Africa have not been engaged in the productive occupations the same productive occupation as their Chinese counterparts, and often end up in personal consumption services or so-called petty services, which do not have the same developmental benefits as manufacturing. This phenomenon is often said to challenge a traditional notion of why and when people move to cities. As you can see in this chart, in Asia and Latin America, there's a correlation between urbanization rates and the share of manufacturing and services in GDP. While in Africa and the Middle East, it has not been the case. If anything, it's a reverse relation. Meanwhile, it appears that natural resource exports are a more important driver of urbanization in Africa and Middle East. There's some controversies in this area, but what is clear is that the African experience perhaps contradicts the long-held view that economic growth is what drives urbanization. In fact, the drivers of economic growth and urbanization are probably, there are some common drivers. Economic growth might be one of them, but it appears that urbanization in Africa was driven by external resource inflows, saturation of rural areas, a demographic transition that has not been accompanied by economic growth, and often conflict and ecological deterioration. So, and this is where the comparison between Africa and China can be instructive, because if there's a long-held view that it is growth that drives urbanization, the African experiences challenges the view. Although we also must hold into account the fact that Chinese urbanization had an important role for mobility controls for workers, right? The hukou system, where people registered either in an urban or rural area, and there's limits on citizens' mobility. But I'll deal with that towards the end of the presentation. Another factor that has influenced the shape of urbanization in China and in Africa is the low savings rates that characterized African urbanization. So if you look at this chart, we can see at the top the differences in savings rate between China and Africa. And what is remarkable in these charts is that even on the eve of transition towards more market-led economy in China in the early 80s, had significantly higher savings rates than Africa had at the time or at the moment. Meanwhile, and that has translated into differences in gross capital formation over the course of development. And so what it shows that, while China had a capital-intensive urbanization process, Africa is facing an undercapitalized urbanization process. Of course, there are regional differences, there are differences between countries, but if we were to generalize, there's a difference in the capital intensity. And that prevents African countries from equaling China in terms of infrastructure spending and capacity expansions. One way in which this undercapitalized urbanization plays out is in African countries' inability to plan ahead of settlement in cities. So as we can see here, China on the left, this chart shows the real estate ratio, inventory ratios. That's the ratio between unsold and sold real estate in square meters. And you can see that China, in most regions within China, have a significant supply of housing even prior to people buying it. There's a surplus of housing in the market. Sometimes it's excessive, sometimes it leads to real estate speculation. But that contrasts sharply with the situation on the right. We can see this is Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and the map shows urban sprawl. What happens often in Africa is that because the lack of capital and the lack of adequate planning means that there's no planning ahead of city expansion. That leads to low density expansion, the non-enforcement of urban land use regulation, and urban sprawl, which is an inefficient use of land and which impacts the correct functioning of African cities. Here we can see a striking illustration of this. There's some selectivity in the choice, but we can compare low-income housing project in Chongqing, and this is Kibera, a famous slum in Nairobi. And we can see how the importance of densification and a capital-heavy urbanization plays out, right? Particularly striking example. Another factor that has driven differences in urbanization between China and Africa is the issue of land management. Here it's important to emphasize a few points. Firstly, we know as many of us know, in China, all land is state-owned. So that's a very different experience from that of Western countries. There's no freehold system in China. Most land allocation is through the leasehold system. But what is interesting about the Chinese experience, looking at land management, is the fact that urbanization, correct urbanization, is not so much always about enforcing the right policies, but in the principles that underpin these policies. And I think that the comparison with the Chinese case here is particularly instructive, right? Because it does not have a market system, does not have a freehold system, but it was still able to enforce a realistic and proactive urban planning, clarify ownership. These reforms took place over time, but through the development of the Chinese land management system, it developed these characteristics, clarity of ownership, introduction of market mechanisms for quasi-market mechanisms for land allocation, which also enabled the state to access revenue from land to finance urbanization, which is, land revenues are the most significant source of revenues for local authorities in China. Meanwhile, in Africa, enforcement of land use is often very feeble. The security for making long-term investments is not there because of overlapping tenure systems and unclear ownership. And land rights are not easily marketable, which prevents an efficient allocation of land within the city and has negative consequences for the shape of urbanization. Another relevant difference between China and Africa has been the issue of local state capacity. Also, I forgot to mention in the previous slide, let us not forget the importance of sometimes the land management system in China can lead to real estate speculation. Sometimes that's an adverse side consequence, but it has enabled local states to finance proactively the urbanization process. That brings us to the role of local state capacity. China, despite being a centralized political system, has a large degree of administrative decentralization. And that comes from a long history of administrative decentralization, not just from the current regime. And the advantages of decentralizing in such a big country is that it allows pilot policies often to be tailored to local needs. There's substantial variation in policies across different regions of China. Local governments are incentivized to account for this variation. They have given freedom to account for it. Decentralization also enables the local governments to raise own source finance, therefore meaning that it allows urbanization to be financed with their own resources, and often generates high satisfaction and legitimacy in local government, which empowers it to implement policies. Africa, there's different degrees of decentralization according to the country. We have some federal states in Africa. Other countries are unitary systems, but have administrative decentralization. And there's different levels of success with decentralization reforms in Africa over time. But what can be observed is often decentralization has not been successful because responsibilities are not clearly allocated across state and local local governments. There's often a lack of capacity in local governments to enforce and coordinate decisions. And legitimacy is very feeble. Often this is also linked to the delegation of responsibilities with a commensurate delegation of fiscal resources. But that has meant that local government has not worked as well in Africa as in China. And here is a potential where there's just some room for learnings between China and Africa, perhaps. With these relevant differences in mind, the next stage of our project consisted of a series of case studies, trying to dig deeper in some of these relevant differences that we've mentioned. So the idea is to compare aspects of the Chinese experience with new empirical research on what has been going on in selected African cities. For these case studies, we have selected Ethiopia and Kenya. Could have selected other countries, but the comparison between Ethiopia and Kenya is interesting because despite being neighbors, they have very different histories, very different political systems, right? in Ethiopia is a more state-led development context. Kenya has a more developed business ecosystem. There's a stronger private sector. Kenya was colonized, Ethiopia wasn't. So we think that the contrast in this stage of the project, contrasting these two countries, can be interesting to find some, to see, what factors drive variation in outcomes across Africa. And in this slide, you can see some of the case studies, some of the themes we have selected for case studies: land and planning ahead of settlement in Addis Ababa, infrastructure investment and coordination in Nairobi, decentralization, we have selected Mombasa in Kenya. But for this presentation, I'm just going to make a couple of slides on urbanization and industrialization, which is a theme we have selected for a case study in Hawassa, Ethiopia. And why Hawassa? Hawassa in Ethiopia is the seat of Ethiopian government's flagship industrial park. It was inaugurated in 2016. Industrial parks are a kind of special economic zones that have been invested on by the Ethiopian government, where it seeks to capitalize on cheap migrant labor to foster industrialization. So you can see immediately, while there's a room for comparison with the Chinese experience, given the importance of special economic zones in China, which we haven't touched upon in the presentation, but you can look at it in the paper. So in selecting Hawassa, the Ethiopian government has made a bet on a model of development that's very similar to that followed by China and other East Asian countries, migrant cheap labor, but also looking at Hawassa, the relevance of the other themes in our project became evident. Issues such as infrastructure, the importance of local government capacity, and planning ahead of settlement. So in the case of Hawassa, one of the most important issues that's being faced by the industrial park so far is that of providing housing to the workers, the migrant workers, mostly young women coming from the surrounding countryside, who come to work at the industrial park to produce garments for international firms. As we can see, at the moment, there's around 34,000 workers employed in Hawassa. Of course, with the current crisis, things might be changing a bit, unfortunately. But one of the main problems currently faced by firms in Hawassa Industrial Park, international garment firms, is that of housing. There's a perception that workers' dissatisfaction with the housing quality, housing availability, and the price of housing is affecting turnover. And that's impacting firms' bottom line and the feasibility of industrialization there. So as you can see from the charts here, this is some data collected by the World Bank last year on the reasons why workers have left their housing. Bolelemi is another industrial park in Ethiopia. Here's Hawassa Industrial Park. We can see that there's a real concern about housing affordability, about distance to the workplace, the quality of housing. Bear in mind that these workers come from rural areas. It's often their first urban experience, and they face a shock in adapting from their rural environment to the urban environment. And it seems that the housing situation, you can see here in the picture, workers often have to share accommodation with 3 or 4 other workers that they might not have done before. You can see the conditions are not very good. And there's a general perception that a lack of housing is impacting the feasibility of industrialization in Ethiopia. And here's where the industrialization, urbanization nexus comes in. And here's also where the Chinese experience can be very relevant for understanding possible policy lessons, but also for understanding what are the relevant differences shaping the development paths of China and some African countries such as Ethiopia. This is based on some research that has been done, some data collection. And, if you look at how did China sort out its housing problem? Because in Ethiopia right now, the problem that's being faced in Hawassa is that building housing is not affordable. International contractors do not find it lucrative to invest in housing there unless there's some subsidy. A domestic supply of housing is not forthcoming because of problems in the housing policy in Ethiopia, the lack of capital to invest in housing. Firms themselves are reluctant to invest, although now they seem to have been moving towards investing in housing, but always with the requirement of subsidies. So just briefly, I cannot get into much depth in this case study, but we did interrogate in this case study the reasons why there hasn't been a supply of housing in Hawassa, and how does this compare to how the issue was tackled in China. And the findings are that in China, the housing policies around industrial parks and special economic zones were flexible. And that's something that's often not told about the Chinese development story. But in the early stages of industrialization, the bulk of the housing was provided by urban villages. That's informal housing, not provided by the government, not capital intensive, but provided by the urban villages that remained within the industrializing cities in China. These housed over half of industrial park workers. Even in Shenzhen, which is often held as a paradigm of special economic zone driven urbanization in China, the urban villages were very important in providing housing for workers, as was the hukou system, which also limited the influx of people into cities, right? People were often tied to the countryside, and their housing needs and other service needs were often provided in the countryside, limiting the demands on cities. And that's something I'm not saying that's correct or that's a normative judgment is made, but that's a relevant difference in the Chinese experience that contrasts what's happening in many African countries, where uncontrolled influxes of people into urban areas are affecting the availability of infrastructure. And this is very clear in Hawassa, where the city has not been able to provide enough housing to the workers coming in. Some of the inquiries on the differences in China and what's the situation in Hawassa has also revealed that the rising levels of labor productivity over time allowed firms and governments to provide more capital intensive forms of housing to the workers. So over time, the prevalence of dormitory housing for workers increased, and eventually that's led to the provision of housing projects by the governments themselves over the course of development as a fiscal resource that became more available. In Ethiopia, that does not seem to be the case. So many of these firms are not breaking even yet. Labor productivity is not rising as much as firms would want. That's for a series of problems. And that limits the affordability of housing solutions for these workers, which in turn then limits the profitability of firms and the speed of urbanization, of industrialization. So it's a kind of catch-22 of the urbanization-industrialization nexus. And so this is, again, where the comparison of China can be instructive. Another difference between what's the situation in China and in Ethiopia has been the policy process. In China, as many of us know, there's an adaptive and flexible policy process with a lot of feedback loops which enable policies to adapt to conditions on the ground. Again, these are not, the policy solutions are not always optimal, but there is some agility in the process. In Ethiopia, there's some governance issues that prevent the same agility to take hold. Communication between different levels of government is often troubled. There's a lot of political problems going on in the country right now, ethnic tensions, and that often prevents policies to adapt rapidly to conditions on the ground. Finally, another difference between China and Ethiopia has been in the source of the financing for their urbanization and industrialization. In China, early stages of industrialization were largely financed by, especially in special economic zones, a lot of it was financed by the Chinese diaspora, which had long-standing links, especially in the southern regions of China. In contrast, in Ethiopia, a lot of the industrialization is largely financed by international firms who invest in Ethiopia often due to some marketing agendas to invest on a sustainable form of industrialization, or often it's international institutions that are providing capital funding industrialization. And that comes with a series of normative demands, which are often hard to accommodate. For example, in Hawassa, what you often observe is that because of the need to adhere to ILO standards in terms of housing, low-cost housing solutions are often not profitable or not feasible, and that can create, can create constraints on the ability of providing housing. While China never had that problem because a lot of its urbanization, industrialization were either self-financed due to the high saving rates that we saw earlier in the presentation, or the capital was provided by diaspora. So this is just an example of how the comparison between Ethiopia and China can be useful for looking at some relevant issues in urbanization. And to conclude, I just want to offer a few thoughts for thinking about charter cities that can be induced from this comparison. One of those is the role of the pre-existing urban fabric in shaping cities' outcomes, right? So the idea of charter cities is building cities ex novo, but what the Chinese experience and the African experience, the comparison between the two reveals, is the importance also of the pre-existing urban institutions, the functioning of the city, the availability of the supply of urban services and other and urban infrastructure to respond to policy changes. And this is an area that needs to be, perhaps, I'm not a specialist in charter cities, but this is an area to take into consideration when thinking about charter cities. And if you look at the experience of China, that is very clear. Another problem, and that's I was mentioned previously in the comparison with Ethiopia. One of the problems in Ethiopia is that the costs of construction are very high. That's due to the macroeconomic environment, the lack of foreign exchange, and the lack of productive capabilities in construction. And so that often means that even if you build a special economic zone, it's hard to disconnect from the domestic business environment, because variables linked to the domestic business environment or the macroeconomy end up influencing your ability to finance city construction. And finally, the way you finance urbanization and industrialization matters. Different kinds of capital comes with different demands. International institutions or publicity-conscious international buying firms often comes with very stringent demands, which often are very good, such as good governance and lack of corruption and so forth. But at low levels of development, there might be a trade-off between enforcing high standards and the feasibility of industrialization. And here, again, the comparison between China and Africa can often be instructive for thinking about this. And I guess this might be also a relevant consideration when thinking about charter cities. So this is a brief overview of our project. If you want to get more information on what we're doing, the background paper is available on the IGC and CIKD websites. The links are there. Our case studies on different cities are forthcoming. And you can also access the website, CSAE, IGC Cities at Work, or we're also available on Twitter. Thanks.
Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, Nicholas. Presentation was great. Really, really interesting paper, and very much appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today. So now on to the Q&A section of this. So I guess firstly, reading through one of the potential critiques that can always be tossed at a comparative case study piece like this paper is, oh well, China is different than Africa, therefore its lessons don't really apply. But I'd like you to maybe address a more specific iteration of that critique. So I think the greatest difference between China and African countries is state capacity. China has the oldest professionalized bureaucracy in the world and is impressively technocratic. African bureaucracies, on the other hand, not so much. They're kind of lacking in state capacity. So what policy prescriptions does your research uncover to try and improve capacity so that African governments, especially local and city governments, can actually implement the kind of public investments the paper recommends?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the issue of state capacity, you cannot escape from state capacity when you're looking at development. And that's one issue that we're going to look at in the Addis Ababa case study. I recognize that it is very relevant for thinking about urbanization, but it's also interesting to break it down a little bit. So, not everything is about state capacity. And I think what can be glimpsed from this comparison between China and Africa is that state capacity does matter. We also need to understand how it matters and what are the analytical mechanisms that underpin the importance of state capacity for urbanization, right? I think one thing that has that we can observe so far from the case studies is that other factors besides state capacity also matter. And so it's actually, state capacity matters insofar as it interacts with other elements of the economic environment and the urban environment. And so I think the important research question for this research agenda is not just realizing the importance of state capacity, is on one hand, breaking down the concept of state capacity and understanding what aspects of it matter for different policy areas. So just an example, you can think about state capacity. You can think about, the internal organizational coherence of the state, for example. You can look at the resources that it can muster for its tasks. You can look at the penetration of the state in society. For example, if you look at Ethiopia, it's in the African context, it's a very strong state relative to other African countries, but it's still one of the poorest countries. Mm-hmm. So state capacity is not everything. So understanding how it shapes urban development is a very important area. And you mentioned China, but despite its millenarian tradition of state capacity, China, on the eve of reform, it was a very poor country, and it had levels of per capita GDP comparable to African countries. So state capacity is not everything, and improving state capacity is definitely an important agenda. But we also need to understand how, for a given level of state capacity, better outcomes can be elicited. Mm-hmm. So perhaps if a country has low state capacity, it might not never reach the quality levels of the quality of policymaking that China or European countries might have. But surely, things can go better for a given level of state capacity. And so this research agenda really, really wants to look. That's why the importance of careful, rigorous empirical research to understand what the policy alternatives are for these African countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I guess semi-related. So China's Belt and Road Initiative, it kind of brings together the two regions of the paper, China and Africa. And it's interesting because you guys try and draw out lessons from China's past urbanization trajectory and apply them to Africa's future urban expansion. But with Belt and Road, right, China will actually be involved pretty intimately in Africa's urbanization process in several of the policy areas you guys discuss in your paper, especially infrastructure investment, right? So I'll put it to you. What do you think the pros and cons of the BRI in Africa are? And I realize that's a big question. So, and Africa is a big place. So if you want to take down a particular country and discuss that one, that's fine if you'd like.
No, yeah. So, in Africa, as I mentioned in the presentation, one of the characteristics of African urbanization is that it's undercapitalized. And therefore, there's a very important role for external actors in providing the capital needed to finance infrastructure, industrialization, and so forth. What often happens in Africa, and I guess BRI can be interpreted as a case of that, is that this infrastructure provision by external actors in Africa is often driven by geopolitical concerns. Mm. This is one of the issues that we're looking at in the Nairobi case study. And one of the things that became clear in that case study is because of these geopolitical factors, the external actors such as China, but also other entities such as the EU or Japan, or international institutions, they lack incentives to coordinate their infrastructure provision. So that's not just an issue about the BRI. Okay, BRI is on a different scale, but that's generally for thinking about infrastructure provision in Africa. And one of the major problems is a lack of coordination. And the lack of coordination can be of two types. It can be intra-government coordination. So, within the same government, often there is no coordination between. So, for example, a road might be built, and electricity or water lines are demolished to create the road, and then they're not built again. One example of for example, a Chinese finance piece of infrastructure that has had a coordination problem is the light rail in Addis, for example, in Addis Ababa, which light rail was built. It was not coordinated with road traffic. There's a lack of electricity provision to it. That means that it cannot function fully. Often investments such as light rail, or you can look at the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya. That's another BRI project. They're not lucrative. The returns to the investment are not enough to repay the debts. And so, there's a number of issues that are raised here. One of that is coordination within the same government. There's a coordination between different stakeholders, external stakeholders. There's the issue also of returns to infrastructure investment. I think no one doubts that Africa is in need of infrastructure. There's, a lot of calculations. There's a lot of numbers are put to the infrastructure deficit in Africa. But to build a particular piece of infrastructure, you need to be sure that you get the adequate returns from it. And something that gets illustrated from comparing, again, the Chinese and African experiences is that infrastructure policies, in a sense, are not additive. They're multiplicative, right? In the sense, an infrastructure fits within a pre-existing context, and the returns you get to that infrastructure depends on the supply responses that it elicits, the presence of complementary infrastructure. And so, that in turn depends on the pre-existing structure of the economy, also depends on coordination in infrastructure. And that is all to say that, if we take all these issues into account, BRI could be a boon to African development. And I believe there's work being done at the moment to ensure greater infrastructure coordination between different stakeholders, issues such as connectivity between different pieces of infrastructure, something that's work in progress. And also, African countries themselves can do something to improve coordination. Research by a colleague of ours, Alexa Zeitz at Oxford, for example, she has shown how, depending on the power structure in African countries, a more concentrated power structure enables African countries to bargain better for infrastructure. So if you're able to bargain better for infrastructure, then you can make it fit your own needs. What often happens in African countries, there's dispersed power structures, different actors in government want to use infrastructure for their own needs, for their own agendas, and infrastructure is not coordinated. And then you have a debt to be repaid without the resources to pay for it. So, so BRI, the success of BRI depends on a number of complementary factors. And it's still ongoing. Let's see how things develop.
Yeah. And we're also going to see some interesting dynamics play out with respect to BRI as a result of the economic fallout in sub-Saharan Africa from the pandemic. We'll see what the Chinese demand in terms of loan repayments, whether they're flexible on the terms of these massive infrastructure loans or whether they start to seize assets is yet to be seen. So it'll be an interesting few months here with respect to BRI. But so last question, the paper goes over the success of, as you mentioned, one of China's first special economic zones, Shenzhen. And based on the huge success of Shenzhen, China scaled up these SEZ reforms to other cities. I think so much so that the stat is today, one could argue that around 90% of Chinese cities are some type of special economic zone. So on the other hand, though, African countries, they've experimented with SEZs, but their performance has been a lot less successful in sub-Saharan Africa. So the big question, I guess I'll put to you to finish it off is, why do you think that is? What explains this big disparity in SEZ performance across regions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. and I think the first step to answering this question would be to demystify the special economic zones a little bit. Because we know when you think of Shenzhen and some of the early special economic zones in China, they were so-called comprehensive special economic zones. Those were, entire cities where the rules of the game were different from the rest of the economy. And that's a very different spirit from your classic export processing zone or free trade zone, which are more focused on just the factories or the industrial output. And that's where the majority of special economic zones in China afterwards, that was most special economic zones in China consisted of this kind of economic trade zones, free trade zones, etc. The special economic zone in China, again, this returns to the theme that a policy only achieves meaning within a given context, right? So the special economic zones in China, the significance of them were often much more about experimentation and reform and winning internal political battles for reform. And even the name special economic zone was chosen as a way to win these political battles. But it is very different in spirit from the kind of special economic zones that were built in Africa, right? In China, I think the lesson from the special economic zones was that the economic fundamentals were there for China to compete successfully in the global economy. And then they removed some of the policy barriers to the movement of these of factors of production and the introduction of market relationships, and the economy flourished. In Africa, if you introduce a special economic zone, but the economic fundamentals are not there, as has been the case in most African countries, then the special economic zone loses its purpose. So the special economic zone is not a universally applicable policy, right? And in most countries, when it has been implemented, it has not been implemented particularly well, and that returns to the theme of bureaucratic capacity that you mentioned, Curtis. But even if it were implemented well, perhaps the policy rationale is not there to start with. And so I think when introducing special economic zones, if African governments need to be very clear on what the purpose of the special economic zone is, what kind of economic constraints, what kind of binding constraints to growth it is tackling, and not think it is, an easy solution. It's just a switch that will somehow trigger industrial development when it isn't. If you look, and that's again, the comparison between China and Africa can be instructive here, because if you look closely at the Chinese experience, you'll see how contextual factors shape the nature of these special economic zones. As I mentioned in the case of Shenzhen, the role of these township and village enterprises in supplying many of the needs of the city, the close links with Hong Kong and the Chinese diaspora capital were very important. And so, special economic zones in Africa have not worked very well so far. Ethiopia perhaps is a more promising example. As you can see, Hawassa Industrial Park has its difficulties. But even there, if you compare very closely, the situation is very different from China. And you can see also that the success of special economic zones depends on other elements of the economic environment. In the case of Ethiopia, one of the main difficulties has been logistics, because it's a landlocked country. And so even if you have one piece of the puzzle, in the absence of the other pieces of the puzzle, things might not work out. And so special economic zones in Africa right now, I think there's a debated question on whether this kind of integration in global value chains in Africa is a good development strategy. We don't know how the world of tomorrow will look, but I guess governments need to think very hard to decide whether that's an applicable policy for their development needs.
Great. Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that I had for you, Nicholas. Again, thanks so much for presenting the paper. Super interesting. If you guys who are watching want to learn more about the research that Nicholas presented today, you can go to the website for the Center for the Study of African Economies, or to the International Growth Center. He showed you where to go a little earlier.
Put it up again.
Yeah. And yeah, he's got it there. And as I said earlier, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm a researcher at the Charter Cities Institute. If you want to learn a little more about what we do, you can go to our website at chartercitiesinstitute.org. You can follow us or subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is where this video will be posted, or you can follow us on Twitter at CCI dot, so DOT city, CITY. Other than that, that is everything. Thanks again, Nicholas, and you have a good one, and stay safe.
Thank you, Curtis. You too. Stay
Yep.
safe.